Welcome to FYI. I'm Barry ZeVan, and my guest today is a person whose face and voice you should certainly know if you watch the PBS NewsHour. He is based here in St. Paul, Minnesota, but has traveled all around the world. If there were other worlds to which to travel, he would be there too. and I say that out of all reverence and respect for Fred Sam Lazaro, correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. Fred, thank you so much for taking the time.
Absolute pleasure, Barry. It's good to be here.
Thank you. My pleasure. So people have seen you do so many stories in so many parts of the world, but I think they'd be interested first to know from where you came and how you got here to St. Paul, Minnesota.
Well, we can dispense with that very, very quickly. I am an immigrant to the United States. I came to the United States in the mid-1970s as a teenager along with my mother, and we began in the Bay Area of San Francisco in the East Bay, and I stayed there for about 3.5 years and then moved to Duluth, Minnesota, where I completed my undergraduate college education. And it was in Duluth that I got my first real job, as opposed to a series of menial ones that just put food on the table, because I was a very, very poor individual. I got my first job at a fledgling organization called Minnesota Public Radio, and was a reporter from the northern part of the region for the NPR network. You might remember that in that time, or during that time, northern Minnesota was going through some severe economic distress as the Iron Range basically folded as many of the mines shut down. And that actually accrued to my benefit as a journalist because I was always on the air reporting on the upheaval that was going on the Mesabi Iron Range at the time, and that was both local and for the Minnesota as well as for the national public radio networks at the time. And it was from there that I then moved to the Twin Cities. I got recruited to work for public television in 1985. Not long after that, to the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, as it was called then. And believe it or not, Barry, I'm still there now, doing essentially the same thing under very different circumstances, because as you know, the media landscape and the business model have both shifted enormously since that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, it says a lot for your work and what you've done. I think, and without being solicitous, but really from the heart, your reports, whenever they come on PBS NewsHour, I would assume, I know my ears perk up and my eyes, because they are not ordinary, and you have not been to ordinary places doing ordinary stories. What motivates you to get the stories that you do? Are they from your suggestions or your producers, or a combination of both?
There's a lot there. First of all, I wouldn't claim to have any sort of heroic impulses that I'm yielding to. I am, like most journalists, a pretty curious person, and like most people, gravitating toward stories that I think I can tell better and more confidently because of my own background. I grew up in a developing world environment. I grew up surrounded by impoverished communities in terms of resources. And so it's easier for a journalist to navigate sometimes in such places. So you build on the strengths that you have, and that's pretty much what's driven me. The next step to it is to find out where you can actually fill a niche. And I think very few people would argue that American television news does not cover adequately the parts of the world where I go. The global south, if you will, sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, like Haiti. These are places where the tourists don't go. It does not mean that they are not important in terms of news. It does not mean that they're not newsworthy. And it's important, we think, and I'll talk about who the we is, it's important to bring these stories before American eyeballs, because it does make a difference in all of our lives, sitting here in Minnesota and elsewhere in the United States. We are a global community, whether we like it or not.
Well, your stories, in my opinion, and the opinion I'm sure of everybody, enlighten us to the point where we would not have been enlightened before. You uncover such detail in regard especially to countries and areas about which we don't think that much. So that has to excite you when you know that you're going to be telling us a story from those kinds of places.
Right. One of the thrills in my line of work is to be able to, as we say, make the foreign less foreign. If something that looks very foreign turns out to be quite similar to an experience that we've had in our lives here in Minnesota, I've clinched something by making that story relevant. If I go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is one of the most dysfunctional countries in the world today, with all manner of problems, and profile a young mother who's trying to find daycare for her children so that she can go to work and bring home some money, that is something that a young mother in Stillwater, Minnesota, or Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, can relate to. It has humanized poverty in a way that strong storytelling can do and needs to do, and that is to make the foreign less foreign. You also asked me how we get these stories. I read a lot, propose a lot, based on educated guesses on where the gaps are. There are a lot of very good correspondents in the world out there filing now for the NewsHour. We try to go to places where I see an opportunity, which is to say a gap, things are not being reported. I'm very fortunate to work for a program and a system, the PBS NewsHour and PBS, that embraces the notion that news coverage ought to be thorough. And we're filling our little niche toward that goal.
Have there ever been any stories you've done either while you're doing the story or afterward that affected you emotionally? That I know a journalist has to be objective and so forth, but have there ever been those kinds of stories? And if so, what were they?
Oh, they're too numerous to mention in many ways. You know, we do, train ourselves to work with a sense of clinical dispassion in many ways. You've got to tell the story that's out there, but the human and humane connections are inevitable. Whether it's in children you help in some way get an education, whether it's, and this is more common, whether it's friendships being forged. And I have forged such friendships. I've been privileged to be able to know a number of extraordinary people who've succeeded or who are trying in very, very difficult circumstances to make life better for themselves and for the people around them. And so yes, you don't come out of this kind of work without having forged very close friendships and a sensitivity to the struggles of people all around the world where we go.
Now, you've expanded this now. The University of St. Thomas apparently has expanded this thanks to, I think, your suggestion. Tell us about that, please.
Essentially, this is the kind of reporting and content that in a pre-internet age would go on the air. A few million people will catch it, and that's the end of it. What the internet has enabled for us is to really create a library of this work and forge it as a body of work that can have enormous impact after the broadcast in helping educate young people about the affairs of the world, about a world that they would not normally tune into. So what we have created is something called the Undertold Stories Project, which is now based at the University of St. Thomas. We have a website, undertoldstories.stthomas.edu, that essentially brings all of our content together in a one-stop shop. You can go on this website, go to at least 300 reports that are on there now, 300 documentaries on a variety of topics which are also classified. And if you're an instructor, if you're a professor, and you want to talk about access to clean water, we've got reports from Israel, from Gaza, from India, from South Africa, from Ethiopia. And there are various solutions-oriented stories on the website that will tell how people are trying to cope with the challenge of getting clean water, for example. It's an extremely impactful way to educate young people because journalism, these short documentaries that we produce, are written in the vernacular of the street. It's as though you and I met in a coffee shop or in a studio and started yakking about this story. It's not like textbook learning. It's very, very effective. And so what we're trying to do is incorporate our reporting into the curricula across the disciplines at St. Thomas. And the University of St. Thomas is also part of a consortium called the Ashoka Changemakers U. And it's all about training young people emerging from our institutions to improve the lives of people, to be in service to the common good, essentially. There are various other slogans that mean the same thing. And our stories tell about people who are change makers, who've made a difference, who have a good idea, who are entrepreneurial, and who are innovative and very committed to improving life. So all of that is put together into this project called the Undertold Stories Project. And we're essentially trying to get this content beyond the television audience to captive audiences in the classroom.
It's wonderful. You said something about stories paralleling in certain countries exactly what, say, a mother would encounter in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. The more you do this, the more you've done it, has that reinforced your thinking that we're pretty much all alike in this world? We all want the same things to get through this as best we can.
We all have the same urges, I dare say. The systems under which we're allowed to seek them are, of course, very, very different. And so that's what makes up the texture that I try to cover, out there in the world. But yes, I mean, we all want to improve the lives of our communities. We all want to improve the lives of the coming generation. And for some of us, it's a lot more difficult than for others of us. Mm-hmm. And what we're able to do nowadays technologically is to share good ideas. And that's another, I think, really valuable thing that we can provide on our platform, the Undertold Stories Project. Who's got the best ideas to tackle A, B, or C of our global challenges? Mm-hmm. It's not, it's not encyclopedic, it's not thorough, but it's a nice smorgasbord of ideas.
Oh, yeah. And so would the students then gravitate toward a particular subject, or as you say, it's all laid out as a smorgasbord? Is it laid out in subject matter or in geographic categories?
Yes, to both. You can find it categorized in different and classified and categorized differently. The model more than likely will be an instructor or a professor, for example. I'll cite you the example of Deb Besser, who's an engineering professor at St. Thomas, and she says to her class as an assignment for their ethics capstone, you need to choose among these 14 Undertold Stories documentaries, choose one or two, and pick out the ethical dilemmas being faced by the lead characters there and write a paper about it.
Outstanding.
So that's one way in which our material can be used in the classroom.
That's what, and they're doing it with real life situations.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
And we'll, you know, we have internships at times, and I've taken interns to the field to learn about, you know, how we make this sausage, you know, called NewsHour reports, to try and essentially help students, if not get their fingernails dirty, get a better understanding of how stuff happens out there in the world. You know, it's a lot more powerful when they can see it unfold in 4K as opposed to reading about it. Nothing wrong with reading about it, but there's something about watching an ordinary person, you know, in a distant land become less foreign.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Have you ever encountered any danger in some of the places you've visited?
We don't, you know, typically, you know, court it, and by that I mean I don't do a lot of reporting in active war zones. We've been to a number of immediate post-conflict zones, whether it's Bosnia, South Sudan, Somalia, but we don't typically seek out war zones. We have had, you know, the odd random incidents that have occurred where we've needed to take cover or flee. But those are very, very, very rare. And I was kicked out of Ethiopia once for reasons that I still don't fully understand. So we sometimes will go through that kind of hassle. Mm-hmm. But as a general rule, no, you know, it's not especially dangerous.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. You know, it's funny, Barry, because I hailed from India, as we might have mentioned earlier, and if you go to India today, or certainly if you did about a year or two ago, there are parents, and there are a lot of Indian students in the United States, but there are parents who say, I don't want my kid going to Chicago to study because I've heard it's a dreadful, murderous place. That is what happens with media images that are powerful. And Chicago had a high murder rate, but that does not deter a gazillion people from going to Chicago, you see. And so similarly, I think a lot of the places where we travel are you know, just seem dangerous because the only reports we ever hear from them are of dysfunction or of violence. Mm-hmm. But you know, while all of that is happening, there are a butcher, baker, and candlestick maker that just need to get on with life. You know, the moms need to go out and find food to bring home to cook for the family at night. Life goes on, and that's where I am. Mm-hmm. You know, typically, I'm not courting danger. I'm just trying to capture real life.
Right. Ever any language barriers, or in most countries do they speak English?
No. You'll find people who can translate for you. You know, the most common languages are English and French, but in most places, you know, it's not hard to find, and we always hire fixers, as they're known, who will do some of our arrangements, run some interference, hire rental cars, and then translate for us.
Mm-hmm. One of your fellow Indians, that's through whom we met, Tom Sengupta, who is a magnificent mm-hmm. human being, and
yes.
He is the first person I ever met when I came to the Twin Cities back in 1970. He kind of identifies himself as being the one who brought our news team together, because the news team in those days was Ted O'Brien, Tom Ryther, and myself. And before we went on the air, we met in Tom's drugstore.
Right across the street from KSTP.
That's right.
On University. It's a legendary place, Barry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the only reason I mention it is people who don't realize, I mean, everybody, I think everybody in the world, maybe this is a silly statement, has more than a modicum of intelligence and abilities. And Tom's daughter, Stephanie Sengupta, to our audience who used to watch Law and Order and now watch Criminal Minds and did watch Hawaii Five-0, Stephanie has been the executive producer of those shows. not only because she knows how to tell a story, but she does it from an incredible background in law herself. She is a lawyer. And so when people are watching those shows, they say, oh, could this happen? Could that happen? Yeah, and it's because of people like Stephanie, and who are of Indian heritage, but for those who don't remember that this country was settled totally by immigrants, they should see and remember examples such as Stephanie's, such as yours, such as Tom's, and I think it levels the playing field a lot more when you think about things like that.
You flatter me, Barry, but thanks. I do think that, you know, we are facing, you know, some obviously difficult and polarized times, and for me, I will say, as a journalist, it is a big relief that I don't have to cover the political beat, because it would be very, very tiresome. I'm able to deal with relatively uncontroversial content, which I still think is very, very important, and I'm passionate about reporting on poverty. But it's a relief not to do the day-to-day, blow-by-blow political reporting, because that would be very draining.
When you are in those countries with the people you're covering, even the translators say, do they ever refer to our current cultural times, or do they?
Depends on where you go. There are places in which Donald Trump is quite popular. India, for example. There are places where he's not. And for the most part, you know, we're so focused on getting to the next appointment and do that next appointment, you know, make it on time, and what are we going to do to regroup if that person didn't? I mean, our worries are much more mundane, believe it or not, than the grand philosophizing about, you know, about politics or anything else.
Yeah, you must have enough frequent flyer miles to fly on the space shuttle by now, I would imagine.
They used to be worth a lot more than they are now, I'll tell you that. But it doesn't get you very far, or not as far as it used to.
Yeah. I think that people should also know, in my opinion, that this business is considered glamorous in some ways by a lot of people who are not in the business, and they don't realize that there's real work involved, and the background and the homework you need to do a good job. For any particular story, just any one you might choose, how long from start to finish, from the time you get the idea until it's completed as a piece on the NewsHour, how long would a typical story take to make?
It varies, and it's hard to pick an average. Sometimes a story idea can not quite languish, but can linger for even years, because I need to be in that geography to make it happen. And then once we get a green light, say I'm going to go to Thailand and do a story about the Meet Chai School, which is the most recent trip that we did. I've wanted to do that for at least a year and a half, maybe even 2 years, but I had to wait until we go to that region in general and combine that assignment with a couple of others that are more timely. So frequently, you know, a story idea can linger on my to-do pile for some time. And then once we get a date roughly firmed up, we then start doing a lot of lead work in terms of finding characters, pre-interviewing them, a lot of setting up, so that once we go into the country with the camera crew, which is a very high cost item with the overhead, you want that time to be spent most efficiently. So the moment we arrive in a country, you know, our calendar is just chock full with things we're going to do until the moment we leave. And we often come up short and have to sort of regroup. So it's very programmed, it's very carefully planned ahead of time. And then predictably, you know, nothing nothing lives up to the prediction, and people don't make their appointments. The story is shifted in some way. And that's part of the excitement in many ways. And sometimes, invariably, in fact, we have pleasant surprises. All of a sudden, there'll be a character that will pop up that we say, wow, this is going to transform this story because we didn't expect this. And it makes a huge difference. A lot of our stories live or die by the strength of their characters. And that is a key attribute for every story. We need to have a very strong character with strong camera presence who can drive the narrative for the story, because a lot of what we cover are stories of human suffering, and nobody wants to watch people suffer chronically, especially. If it's an emergency, yes, we'll mobilize to help an earthquake victim, no problem with that. But the chronic day in, day out suffering is very hard to draw eyeballs to unless you have a good story, a strong character, and some kind of solutions-oriented narrative, and that's what we're looking for. Once we get into the country, it takes, typically about 10 days, and we come back with about 3 stories of about 7 or 8 minutes apiece.
Wow. How many in your crew?
Typically 2 people along with me, a producer and a camera operator. Once in country, we'll hire a local fixer, and frequently there's somebody who's the driver as well. Mm-hmm. So 4 to 5 people.
So if you're going to, say, East Africa, as you've been, and
we'll be very soon.
So many other places. Mm-hmm. When you fly into a major airport, then you take a vehicle into the bush, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's all been arranged ahead of time by the fixer. We've got no time to waste shopping. It's all been done. And so once we're in, as I said, everything's been lined up. Almost everything's been lined up. And we have to be flexible to change some things that have not lived up to what we thought they were going to do, and somehow manage.
Have people in media in those countries empathized with, in a good way, with the fact you do what you do?
It varies. It varies. The local journalism scene is as different as many of the countries are, but the approaches can be very different depending on the audience as well. Mm-hmm. Because the way we report is for an American audience. We are working to make sense to an audience that is, somebody living in South Dakota, for example. Right. And it's very frequent that, I will have a soundbite in a story, for example, and the person is speaking English, very articulate, may not be able to understand it. I take it to the front desk, to the receptionist in the office, and say, close your eyes, I'm going to play you this 30-second soundbite. Tell me if you understand it. That's how you know.
I can't thank you enough, Fred. Thank you so very much.
Absolute pleasure.
And my pleasure. Again, I cannot thank Fred de Sam Lazaro from the PBS NewsHour for being with us today. I also want to thank you in advance for possibly ordering my book on Amazon. It's my life story, and Fred even has a copy, by the way. And shameless plug time, but hope you'll take a look at it. Thank you so much.